Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and start getting this together, but we can, if anybody comes in late, we'll do a recap and everything. Make sure that you sign in my in-person persons so that you get credit for being here. My online persons, I did not send out a packet today. I've actually gotten a couple of questions about that. There was no packet to attach to the email today because most everything that we're going to go over today is online. You can get the forms and charts on our website, and the ones that you can't get on our website, you can download from census.gov. So I will show you where all that stuff is at the end of class. But mostly this one is going to be kind of just going over the different censuses. This is the first time that we have taught this one as a separate entity. I've taught this class a couple of times before, but it was always US Census records all the way through. So from 1790 all the way up to 1940. And you can imagine that was a lot to try to cram into 1 hour. So we've now split it. I'm letting everybody know in advance, don't panic. You did not miss the first half of this class. There are actually 3 parts to this series. The newest one we just did a few months ago was called US Census Records Non-Population Schedules. So it covered things like the veteran censuses, it covered mortality schedules, it covered agricultural schedules, that kind of thing. And one of the things that we did not get the opportunity to go deeply into in that class was the slave schedules. And we didn't go into it because A, we were running out of time, and B, because we go into them a little more in depth in this class. So after I taught that class a few months ago, I had several people reach out to me and ask me specifically to teach the second part of this class so we can talk about the slave schedules and how to help use them to break back through that wall of emancipation if your ancestors were enslaved. And so we're going to talk about that today. In fact, here we'll go right into it. If it'll, there we go. Oh no, it cut out my my class objectives slide. But our class objectives today is going to be to go over the different censuses. We're going to talk a little bit about each individual one. We're going to talk about the changing landscape of the United States throughout those years and some of the different socioeconomic and natural and physical things that changed the way our ancestors lived that you can kind of look into and might help you understand a little bit better why your ancestors made some of the decisions that they made. We're also going to follow a case study all the way through. So from 1850 all the way up to 1940, we're going to trace some lineage so that you can see how these can help you build that tree further and further back. We're kind of going to go in the wrong direction for that. We're going to go as descendants instead of ancestors just because we're moving linearly through the timeline, but you're still going to get the idea of how it works. So we're going to start off right here, straight into it with the 7th census of the United States. This was taken June 1st of 1850. We start the split here because this is the first time that every free person in the United States was enumerated by name. So before this, everybody was only enumerated as the head of the household, and then the people within that household were enumerated as tally marks. We're going to go into that when we teach the first half of the class, which is the 1790 to 1840 portion of the class. So we're not going to talk too much about that, but this is the first time that you will see every person in the household enumerated by name, so long as they are free individuals. Free people of color were enumerated just like white people were. Native American persons, if they had left their home tribes and assimilated into white society, they were enumerated just like white people were. The Indian census rolls started kind of on and off right about this time. They don't really take off until about 1885. So if you are trying to trace Native American genealogy, there's a slightly different path for you in that. And we talk about that in that US Census non-population schedules class. So we'll teach that one again next year so that you can kind of trace that way. Starting off on this census, we have 4 new states that include Florida, Texas, Iowa, and Wisconsin. And there are 2 unorganized territory areas of the country, as well as the return of the Minnesota Territory. So that had been dropped in the 1840s and returned in the 1850s. This is also the first time, whoops, went too far. This is also the first time that we will see people in slavery enumerated and described individually. So let's start off with looking directly at the 1850 slave schedule. People in slavery were very rarely named individually. When they were, it was usually only a first name given, and it was usually extenuating circumstances. So we're talking about individuals who were very advanced in age, usually over 100. We're talking about people who had a very specialized set of skills, which made them more, there's no nice way to say, more valuable to the slave owner. And then we're also talking about people who were considered fugitives from the state. So if they had run away from their enslavers, they were usually named on these schedules by name for tax reasons and other reasons. Not always. In fact, it's actually more uncommon to see them named there than common, but it did happen. So that's one way that you can try to look your person up. But unfortunately, as you see here, it doesn't happen very often. Almost always you will be looking for enslaved persons under the name of their enslaver. Some enumerators did list the given names of slaves, particularly over those over 100 years of age. So we're going to talk real quickly about how to trace which person you might be looking for. Here you can see a column for each person's physical description. So here in the upper left corner, starting with this very first young man, we have a male, 15, black, 1. So in the number of slaves column, we've seen this done several different ways depending on the enumerator. Here we have them listed as 1 slave who is 15, male and black, 1 who is 14, female and black, 1 who is 9, male and mulatto, so on and so forth. If there is 2 people who fit those descriptions, there would be a 2 here generally. If there are 3 people who fit that description, so we had 3 15-year-old black males, there would be a 3 there. You'll also sometimes see it just listed in numerical order, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, so that when you got to the bottom of the list, you had a tally of how many people were enslaved on that property. Or sometimes you will see it listed this way, or not this way. You will see it listed so that they have different numbers for like one total number at the top, and then they won't enumerate everybody underneath. Kind of depended on whoever was taking the census at the time. We talked briefly, quickly about fugitives from the state. If a person escaped slavery, he or she was to be tallied among the slave owner's schedule anyway, as they were still considered to be part of his estate and marked in this column as a fugitive from the state. And then the number manumitted is the number of people in slavery who had either bought their freedom from this estate or whom the enslaver had freed for whatever reason. So again, that's still counted as part of the tally, even if that person was no longer enslaved on the property. And then we're going to run into a lot of terms in these old censuses that we don't use anymore. I'm going to read them exactly as they were written for historical purposes. So this was a tally for anybody who was deaf, dumb, blind, insane, or idiotic. So anybody who was struggling with any mental or physical disability was enumerated on this census as under this column. So tracing a person who is in slavery, unfortunately, often means tracing the enslaver's property. Here's a really good example. So this one that we've been looking at here, down here at the bottom, I'm pointing at my screen, I'm sorry, y'all can't see my screen. This one here is A. Bird, it's Abram Bird. He is a resident of East Baton Rouge Parish. And his daughter, Mary, married Gilbert Daigle a few years before this census, and several of the persons who had been enslaved on his property were moved to his daughters when they were married as part of her dowry or as a gift. So it's important, unfortunately, to kind of know the movements of the enslavers to be able to account for where the enslaved persons may have been moved. We're going to talk a little bit more about how you can help trace that when we get to the 1870 census after emancipation. Looking around your ancestor can help you answer some of the questions of where they may have been before emancipation. This is the regular 1850 population schedule for the free persons. This is the first time that we know houses were visited in a specific order. Some enumerators did visit houses in a specific order before this point, but there was no way to trace what order they were visited in. This is the first time we have columns that actually enumerate the dwelling houses and the number of people number of families who lived in them. So oftentimes you can see here our number in the left column is 1813 and our number in the right is 2000. You're going to see that happen quite often when you have a lot of boarding houses, hotels, long-term establishments, hospitals, asylums, that kind of thing in the area. They will often enumerate the different families living within a boarding house as a separate family, even though it's the same dwelling number. So that's why you'll often see the second number to be higher than the first. The opposite can also be true if it's an area that's struggling economically and you have a lot of empty homes. You'll see this a lot out west as those mining towns began to dissipate. You'll have a lot of empties in the middle of your number on the right will be lower because there are no families living in the houses that were visited. The name of every person whose usual place of abode on the first day of June 1850 was in this family. So we're looking at this family here, and we see that this was not actually enumerated until the 23rd of October of 1850. That means that when the enumerator went to this house and knocked on the door, everybody who answered these questions were supposed to answer them as if they were answering them on June 1st. So if a child was born after June 1st, they were not supposed to be counted on this census. If somebody died before June 1st, or after June 1st, that's right. I had to stop and think about that for a second. After June 1st, they were supposed to be counted anyway because they would have still been alive, even if they weren't alive by October. So unfortunately, however, you'll often see, I happen to know this is the Case family that we're studying all the way through, and I happen to know the birth dates of most of these children. And most of the time, we're going to talk about this in this section a little bit, people didn't often do that. So you'll see babies that were born after the beginning of June that are being counted. You'll see people who died that should have showed up on the census but didn't. Again, all of this information, like I said, such as ages, are supposed to reflect the description of the persons as of June 1st. However, we know that Edward here on line 3 was born in August, so he was only supposed to be 20. And so was Helen, who is here on line 5. She's also an August baby, so she should have technically only been 14 because we're backdating to June 1st. So this is one of those things that can throw you off as you're doing your schedule or as you're doing your research. You can have people who look older than they should be or look younger than they should be, depending on how they answered those questions. Come on, roll over. There it goes. Profession, occupation, or trade of each male person over 15 years of age. People under the age of 15 worked a lot. People, women worked outside the home a lot, but they weren't counted on here. In fact, I happen to know that Charlotte was a teacher, but she doesn't have that listed here because she's not male. So just because you don't see things listed on the census does not mean that they didn't happen, or just because you might find records that say Charlotte Parham was a teacher doesn't mean just because it doesn't show up on the census that those records are wrong. There's always room to double check anything you use as a source. Value of the real estate owned. Oftentimes you see here, our family that we're looking at here does not have anything in this column, probably renting. They don't own any real estate. The place of birth, naming the state, territory, and country. This is also the first time this kind of information shows up on these censuses. So prior to 1850, you don't know where every person on your census was born. So it's really important to take note of not only the person you're searching for who was born, say, in Massachusetts, but where all the children were born, because those years can help you really trace the movements of the family. If you have one child who was born in 1835 in Vermont and one child who was born in 1840 in New Hampshire, we know that somewhere in between those 2 years, the family moved. Married within the year, attended school within the year, and persons over 20 years of age who cannot read and write. Again, these kinds of things tell you a lot more about the area around your family than just about your family itself. Maybe everybody in the family could read and write, but if there's a lot of people in the area, if you have a lot of children in the area who did not attend school within the year, tells you that we probably either lack a schoolhouse or lack a teacher. If you have a lot of people in the area who can't read and write, same thing may apply. Also could be that it's just a really poor area, and if you have to choose between farming to feed your family and sending your kid to school, unfortunately, it was a very real part of life to have to make that choice. And same thing here, we're trying to trace the population who was struggling with disabilities through here. A lot of the things as we trace this through, we're going to see that change what the government is trying to figure out about the population. In 1850, as we start heading toward the United States being a more cohesive power in the world, I guess is what I'm aiming for there. They were trying to get a feel for what they could do as far as a draft went. So we're trying to get an idea of how many people we have that are able-bodied, young, healthy, who could serve in the military if it became necessary. So this is our case study family. We're looking at Paul Parham here. He's 46 years of age, a shoemaker born in Massachusetts. These are his children, and we're going to notice that there is something missing in this family. I know, or in this census, I'm sorry, I know that Charlotte is Paul's daughter, but I only know that because of my research and finding her birth record. She very well, at her age, could have been his wife. She wouldn't have been obviously old enough to be the mother of the rest of these kids, but she could have been a second wife. She could have been, we don't necessarily know just looking at this how all of these people are related. But I know that Paul's first wife, Rachel, actually died in 1849 of tuberculosis. So these are his children. All right, so now we're moving into 1860. We have 3 new states in this census: California, Minnesota, and Oregon. New territories, we can see that huge westward expanse has finally been broken up into several different territories. This includes Washington, Nebraska, New Mexico, Utah, Kansas, and the Indian Territory, which of course would later become Oklahoma. Our total population this year is about 31.4 million. For comparison, that is almost about roughly half of the population of California now. So you can see how much the population has grown in the last 150 years or so. People in slavery account for about 12.5% of the total population. That's 3.95 million. 33 states, 7 territories. The most populated state is New York and the least populated is Oregon. We're going to look at some of that as well. The slave schedules in 1860 are very similar to those in 1850 with only one noticeable difference, and that's a column added to each side to specify the number of slave houses on the property. So again, this is for tax purposes. We're tracing the enslavers' finances for tax reasons, that kind of thing. There are only a few changes in the free inhabitants schedule here as well. All of the highlighted columns here are fairly close to what we saw in 1850. We are going to talk very briefly about a couple of different ones. So the profession and occupation now says each person, male and female, over 15 years of age. Again, people under the age of 15 definitely were also working. They just didn't count on the census. Value of real estate now has a comparable column that reads value of personal estate. So we're talking about like $5,700 for the real estate, $1,000 for the personal estate. It's pretty good for 1860. And this is our family we're tracing again. Here's Paul. Now we're starting to see some massive changes. You can see here the town of Ashford, which is in Cattaraugus County in New York. So we are no longer in Vermont. We don't know, the person's occupation lines up, the person's age lines up, but obviously we've lost a whole handful of children and we're remarried to somebody completely different and have another child. So how do we find out if this is the right person? Parham is not a completely uncommon last name, and obviously Paul is not an uncommon first name. So how do you find out whether or not you're looking at the right person? Sometimes there's not going to be an immediate answer, and so y'all are not going to get an immediate answer on that right now. All right, we're moving on to 1870. This is one that I really wanted to spend some time on because this is the first census, obviously, post-emancipation. This is the first census where every person in the United States is going to be enumerated, or supposed to be enumerated, I should say. Yes, people did get missed. And this is going to be 4 new states this census: Kansas, Nebraska, West Virginia has split off of Virginia, and Nevada. New territories include Idaho, Montana, Dakota, Wyoming, Colorado, Arizona, and the Department of Alaska. And you can see that our boundaries are starting to look very familiar. This is about the first time that you can see the United States looking the way we're familiar with it looking now. Total population, 38,925,598. Most populated remains New York. The least populated is Nevada. Get used to seeing that. Nobody wants to live in Nevada. Okay, so again, in 1870, most all of the highlighted, you're going to see a lot of these. Not all of that is going to change. When you're enumerating every person by name, age, sex, race, that kind of thing, that sort of stuff is not going to change. But we will see changes to the way that this information is collected. And it's going to be very obvious to you as you compare these censuses, what information it was that they were looking for as they took these censuses. So when these forms were sent out, the government was specifically trying to collect certain information from the population, and it varies depending on what's going on in the country at the time. So this is immediately post-Civil War. So some of these questions are going to be centered a lot around that kind of thing. We're going to talk about it in a minute. Parentage, father of foreign birth and mother of foreign birth. These columns can be very helpful in determining the origins of your family members. If their parents were born in the US, then you're not going to have anything in these columns and it won't really help you. But if they were immigrants, it can help you get started knowing that the next generation back you look for is going to have to be outside the United States. Were they former people in slavery or children of people who were? And if so, were their parents born in the US or were they brought over by force? The only indication you have is a little mark in these boxes, but it can tell you a lot. That will build on further censuses or future censuses as well. Make sure I'm not missing anything. Okay, so if born this year, state month, January, February, etc., or if married within the year, state the month, January, February, etc. This can really help you narrow down months for births or marriages if you're lucky enough to have a person who was born or married in that time period. Little Effa Temley, who's highlighted here, their age and months should appear here in this age box, and then what month it was. Again, note that because of the date of this census, this should probably read 1 of 12, because if she was born in May, this is supposed to have been taken first day of June of 1870. So she should have been no older than a month anyway, but obviously the parents didn't backdate like they were supposed to. So always be aware of the fact that the information that's reflected on the census can be at the discretion of the parent, can be at the discretion of the spouse. So if the census taker comes and asks the questions of the wife while the husband is at work, she has to rely on her own memory to know where his parents were born. So you can sometimes see on one census that a parent was born here in the US, and on another census, you might see that the parent was born outside the US. That could be why. Same thing for birth dates. Most of the time, this is well before there were actual birth certificates. You're relying on the memories of the parents or the memory of the person themselves. Attending school within the year, attending school within the year and cannot read and cannot write. Again, we're looking at a lot of changes throughout the United States at this point. We're not just looking at the movement of people who had formerly been in slavery, but the Civil War upended lives for a lot of people all across the country. We're also looking at a time period that was very heavy in westward expansion. So a lot of the Oregon Trail, that kind of thing is going on at this point. So they're trying to track how people are getting their education, whether or not they're getting their education. This also plays into this next question. This is called constitutional relations. And I'm going to read this directly because it's kind of important that we get the wording right. So excuse me as I shorten this window. All male citizens of the United States, regardless of race or other determining factor, should appear here in this first column. Entitled Male Citizens of the U.S. 21 years of age and upward. First Nations people who were not citizens of the United States were not counted. The second column, male citizens of 21 years of age and upward whose right to vote was denied or abridged on other grounds than rebellion or another crime, should have a tally mark if the citizen admits that he fits that description. The 15th Amendment of the United States Constitution stated that all men, regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, were to have the right to vote. However, after emancipation, there were many states who began to ratify their voting laws to have requirements specifically aimed at excluding people who were formerly enslaved. Requirements to pay poll taxes, own a certain amount of land, have a certain amount of money, or any number of other restrictions. As an attempt to get an understanding of the extent of this blatant disregard for the constitutional right of millions of US citizens, this question was included on the 1870 census. Louisiana was one of the states where this was rampant. So you will see a lot of this happening. However, it also requires that the person who was answering this question be honest. And for a lot of the men who were dealing with this at the time, their lives were already upended. Race relations were very much not good at this point in time. So a lot of them did not want to make the waves of admitting that this was a problem. So just because you don't necessarily see a lot of the tallies in there doesn't mean that it wasn't happening. Yes, ma'am. We have a question? Oh, Native Americans.
Oh,
Different Native American communities. She was asking what First Nations was. All right. So that's why that question is important. And you may see a lot of marks in that column, and you may not see, you can see here, we don't have any of that issue in this particular excerpt of the census. But again, this is one of those things that can really give you a hint as to the political environment of your ancestors at the time. So here we're following our family again. We have moved on to, this is the same town. Actually, it's Salamanca, which is like another tiny town next to Ashford, but it's the same county and everything. And here we have Lucy, and we have Willis, who's now 11, and they have one more daughter named Emma, who's 8, but we're noticing that we have somebody obviously missing here. Paul has we either have a different person, or he has moved away from his family or a second time, or he has died. For anybody keeping score, $250 in 1870 is about $4,900 in 2019. So it looks like Lucy's actually doing better without Paul around than she was when he was there. Paul was not a great person. So now we're going to look at 1880. There are a lot of really good changes on this census. So this is one of those things that I kind of wanted to, like the 70, I want to dive a little deeper into it, and then we're going to skip over some of the ones that don't change as much. 6 new states recorded on this census: Washington, Wyoming, Idaho, Montana, North and South Dakota, and the Oklahoma Territory has appeared here, although it's not marked on this map, and I don't know why. Many historians believe that the total population, I've got the wrong statistics here. Ignore that. I copied the wrong statistics for this one, but the states are right. So this is our 1880 population schedule. Again, this one is one that follows quite a few similarities to previous forms. So I'm going to only highlight the differences kind of to keep things moving because we're already 30 minutes in. Finally, we have a box that tells you the relationship of each of these people. However, never take this for set in stone truth either. Sometimes the enumerator would get it wrong. Sometimes the person who was giving the information would get it wrong. There were language barriers. There were accent barriers. So this is always probably a pretty decent place to start. You can see here we have wife, son, daughter, niece. They have their niece living with them. So this is a pretty good place to start, but just because you find another record that may contradict a piece of this information doesn't necessarily mean that it's right or wrong. Civil condition: single, married, widowed, or with a D for divorced. The separate column on the right reads married within the census year. Later, these will converge down. You'll just put an initial in there because it got to be too many different boxes. Number of months this person has been unemployed during the census year. Columns like this are even more helpful than the simple scope of life within the target family you're looking for. Lines like this help you get an overall view of the lack or help thereof of job industries in certain areas. If there are a lot of people who've been out of work in an area, it might indicate changes: a natural disaster, closing of some kind of factory or business that supported the community very well, railroads that left the area, mines that closed. There's lots of different things that can explain a sudden spike in unemployment. And this is another one of those questions that you can see they were asking to try to get a finger on how employment was starting to come back after the Civil War. So again, we're looking at about 15 years after the Civil War at this point. So we're trying to get a feel for how the nation is beginning to recuperate from the losses of the Civil War. You can also see that there are a lot of marks in this column, but no numbers. A lot of times enumerators would use those empty columns to tally for whatever else. But because we don't see a lot of numbers in this column, as in number of months that a person has been unemployed, we have a pretty good indication that most of the people here have steady jobs, and the job market in this area is not struggling like it might be in some others. This one will help you a lot more than the last census. This is the place of birth of this father, naming the state or territory within the United States or the country if of foreign birth. Same thing for the mother. So if your person made it to 1880 and you knew that they had a parent who was born outside the US, now you have an idea of where. If your person died between 1870 and 1880, if you're lucky enough to have that happen, a lot of times looking around your target family can help you answer that question. Do you have a lot of people who live very close nearby that have the same last name as your target person? They may very well be families. A lot of immigrant families traveled together. So it can help you to kind of look into the lives of some of the people that lived around your person. If you see that a lot of people in the same area were all German immigrants, a lot of people who traveled settled with things that they knew and understood. So German immigrants often settled in an area together. Italian immigrants often settled in an area together. These were people who understood your culture, spoke your language, shared your food, your history, that kind of thing. So communities often came together around things that they knew. So if your ancestor dies between 1870 and 1880, and you know that their parents were of foreign birth, looking around the community where they had settled can often help you answer those questions, and you might give you a direction where to start looking. So here we have Lucy, Willis, and Emma. Now it's time to answer our age-old question. Did we really have the correct Paul Parham? I knew my family's Paul had been from New York. Willis, his son, is my great-great-grandfather, and I knew that we had family in Massachusetts. This one had fit. He was the right age, the right birthplace, the right profession. But Parham wasn't an uncommon name, and of course, Paul is not either. So could I have had two different Paul Parhams here? Could I have been blaming an innocent man for running out on his first family and leaving his second completely destitute? Because I know that the 1865 New York State Census has his wife and children living in the poorhouse. And come here. This is how you answer your question. We talked in the previous class, if I know a couple of you attended my non-population schedules class, and a couple of you attended my tracing female ancestors class. We talked about the FAN method in both of those, tracing your family and your associates and your neighbors. This is exactly what we're talking about. Turns out I did not need to look too far to answer that question. Benjamin Parham, seen in the top box here, is Paul's half-brother. Through records, further research, and other censuses, I can see that Benjamin and his wife Henrietta took in Paul's 4 youngest children after Rachel's death. Edward, listed here on the census on this line, is his nephew, is the only one that still remains with the family 30 years later. Their dwelling and family numbers are one off of Lucy's, meaning that they live next door. Fast. In East Dayton Street, in Dayton now. I believe they probably moved down to help her out after Paul's death sometime between 1862 and 1865. This is how you answer your question, whether or not you have the correct person. Somebody like the Parhams, this is less of a problem because it is a fairly uncommon last name, not super uncommon, but not super common either. But if you have somebody like Baker, Miller, Smith, this is the kind of thing that will help you tie your families together. Moving on to 1890, we have a couple new census or states recorded on this census. Many historians and even census takers of the time thought that the total population for this census is way too low, probably due to the rush of processing the census to prove the usefulness of their new tabulating machines. Most of them at the time thought that this number was a lot closer to about 75 million. So we're missing people. And we're missing people because, as many of you know, if you've done any genealogical research at all, the 1890 census was destroyed. On January 10th of 1921, a fire broke out at the Commerce Building in Washington, D.C., where the records were being stored for the previous iterations of the census. What the fire did not destroy, the water did when hoses were pushed through the basement windows and unleashed on the blaze. By the time the sun came up on January 11th, 99.99% of the 1890 records had been burned or were soaked with water and later destroyed. Of the estimated 63 million records collected, only 6,100 of them remain. It's also estimated that parts of the 1790, 1800s, 10, and 20 censuses were destroyed in this blaze as well. The only census to not receive any damage at all was the 1920, which had just been taken the year before and was still being enumerated in a different part of the building. The 1890 census can be a solid brick wall for many researchers. For a large number of people, this missing piece can leave a 20-year hole in your research, especially for people who are trying to trace those who had been formerly in slavery. You're talking about only, 25 years after slavery ended? So you're not that's not a very long time to establish where your family is, follow their movements. There was so much movement post-emancipation that a lot of them were still in the process of moving around the country. This can really leave you with 20 years to try to find your missing family. So we're going to talk instead of what was covered on this census, because not very much of it remains anymore. We're going to talk about ways to work around it. I will be completely honest with y'all. These are the areas where there are still a few records left. I'm going to be completely honest with you. I've never met anyone in my time doing genealogy who's found a family member on the 90 census. I'm sure there are some out there, but I've never met anybody. These are the places that did actually still contain some records. So this is the first thing that you want to check. Just make sure, especially if your family is from like Perry County, Alabama, there were actually about 2,500 records that survived from that area. Washington, D.C. as well, 1,500. So, you know, if your family is from one of these areas, check that first. But you can see like Wright County, Minnesota did technically have some remaining censuses, but it was only 4 entries. So it's probably one family out of the whole county. The next thing that you want to look at probably to kind of bridge that gap are state censuses. States were taking censuses pretty regularly, especially when they were either applying for statehood or they had just recently been granted statehood, because that's how they, you know, established what kind of taxes they would receive, what kind of government representation they would get, that kind of thing. So you can see here, like Alaska and Washington down here, they're like taking censuses every year. They're crazy with their censuses over there. There are also a lot of states, you know, Pennsylvania being one of them, where I'm from, that just really never took one. So, you know, it's kind of luck of the draw, but this is another thing to check if your family is from one of these areas. Other things you can check: city and farm directories, land sales, property sales. So start looking around the last place that you knew that your family was and see if you can establish a timeline for their movements through some of those databases. Newspapers, journals, diaries, and society pages, family history books, family Bibles, church records. We have the Father Hebert collection over there that can provide some really nice filling in for that kind of a gap. And there are lots of ways that you can kind of work around it. You just have to think outside the box and get a little creative. There are also a few substitute databases. Ancestry has one. I do believe, Mr. John, does Family Search have one too? Okay, I didn't think so, but I wanted to make sure before I said that. So yeah, a lot of these places will actually have database. Well, not a lot of these places. This place actually has a database that can kind of help fill in with that. There was also a veterans census taken in 1890. Half of that survived the blaze as well. So the second half of the alphabet, Kentucky, half of Kentucky through the end of the alphabet survived. Anything before that, so if you had family in Alabama, unfortunately, you may be out of luck with that as well. It just kind of requires piecing things together and trying to find some ways around it. Whoops, wrong way. Okay, so a state census, we talk a lot about state censuses in the other class, in the non-population schedules class, so I'm not going to go very deeply into it here, but one of the things that we want to point out when you're dealing with a state census is that you're not to expect to get the amount of information from a state census that you should have gotten from the population schedule. You can see here, you're still able to use the fan method by looking around our people, and it'll give you a glimpse of who lived in the home. Each state counted different information on their censuses. So there's not a federal database for the state censuses like there was for the population schedules. Everybody who got the population schedules got the same schedules when they handed them out to each state. Each state who conducted their own did it differently. So it's going to contain different information for each one. But it should answer a few questions about where someone might have lived and what they were doing at the time. So you can see here their occupation, what country they were born in, age, sex, race, that kind of thing. So as you can see here, state censuses wouldn't give you anywhere near as much information, but we're able to see that within the last 12 years, because this one was taken in 1892. So it does bridge that gap a little bit. We can see here that Willis has gotten married. His wife's name is also Emma. That's really fun to try to do some research on, let me tell you. And then they have 3 daughters, and his wife, or his sister, see, told you, is living with them at the time. And now we're going to look at the 12th census, the 1900. One new state, Utah, not much else changes here. You can see down here, it's going to give you the stretch of time for each change. So you can see that nothing is really going to change too much until about 1907. The population here is listed as 76 million, and most populated state is still New York, least populated state is still Nevada. All of this is going to be fairly similar to the previous years. As I said, we're not going to go into things that are pretty similar to the previous ones because we're trying to make up for time. But I do want to hit on some things that will help specifically in a particular kind of research. So we're going to notice a couple of things here. Number one, this record is really dark because the ink was faded. The census takers were supposed to use specific kinds of ink when they took these censuses. Not all of them did that. So it was really, really badly faded. You can also see that he took several notes over top of all the writing. I wanted to give you a glimpse into some things that you can do when you run across a census record that looks like this. I ran this through lunapic.com, which is a free website, and it's basically free Photoshop software. It is not as powerful as an Adobe Photoshop would be. But for tweaking an image to make my ink a little bit darker, to make my contrast a little bit better, it worked great for that. Even paper documents that you have on hand at home. So if you have any diaries, letters, that kind of thing that might go with your research, you can bring them in here. We will help you scan them. We have a flatbed scanner, we have a book scanner, we have all kinds of stuff here in the library, maps, all kinds of things. That you can use to scan it, and then you can run that through the software too. So once you have that scan on hand, if the handwriting is too bad or the contrast is too bad, you can do all that stuff here and then run it through that. Yes, ma'am. It's Luna, L-U-N-A, pic.com. And it's a free software. There are other things. There's programs that you can download on your computer if you prefer to do it that way instead of online. If you have something that you're struggling with at home to do your research, you can always come in and see us. We'll see if we can help you figure it out. Date and month. A date of birth now includes a month and year for each person enumerated. Again, this should theoretically help you really narrow things down. But once again, you're relying on memory. This still is actually pretty close to previous to birth certificates for most places. Louisiana didn't start keeping birth records across the entire state until about 1918. And even then, it went about like you'd imagine a new government mandate going. So you can't really expect to regularly see birth records for every person until the 20s, mid-20s. So we're relying on family Bibles, we're relying on memories, we're relying on maybe, if you were lucky, somebody actually wrote you a return of a birth, but not often. For somebody with like 12 children, it's entirely likely that you might find contradicting information because trying to remember the names, the dates of birth for our 12 kids. We now have a slightly expanded box for ownership of the home. And this is going to tell you a lot about your family and their financial status at the time. So this is going to cover things like whether the home was owned or rented, whether it was free or mortgaged, whether you lived on a house or a farm, and then that last box is the number of your farm schedule. Again, the non-population schedules class, we go into the agricultural schedules pretty heavily. It's one of the three that we go deeply into in that class. And what it can tell you about your ancestors is pretty impressive. It'll talk about what was grown on the farm, how much it was, how much value it had, what kind of equipment they had, what kind of animals they raised, what buildings were on the property. Whoops. So if you are trying to do some heavy research into the movements of your family and what their lives were like, there's a lot of places that you can look, and that is one of them. The DAR library often has those. Some of them are in the National Archives. We actually have Louisiana's here. So if you find an ancestor who owns a piece of property, or owns a farm rather, and you want to know more about it, we have the agricultural schedules on microfilm here. These are the last two boxes that I want to talk about. This is never a fun conversation, but it is a reality into the look of life in the early 1900s. These two boxes are for each woman over the age, I think, of 18, they were supposed to ask. mother of how many children, and number of those children still living. So it can be a huge help if you were looking for a family member you believe to have had more children, or filling in the blanks on those ones that you think are missing. It can also help you determine if you've accidentally attached children to incorrect parents. So if you have 7 children listed on your paperwork, but this woman answers that she only has 3, you probably need to do some double checking on your research, because she probably knows how many kids she's had. All right, so now we're looking at Willis and Emma and their children here. From here, you can see our new info in action. You can see birth months and years for each family member. You can see that Emma has had 7 children, of which 5 are still living. Willis owns his house, but there's a mortgage on it. They live on a house, not a farm. A couple of things of note. Again, we're relying on memory here. So we have Willis's father listed here as being born in Vermont. We know that his father was actually born in Massachusetts. However, Paul would have died when Willis was no more than 5 or 6 years old. All of his siblings were born in Vermont, and his uncles were born in Vermont. So it's entirely possible that Willis believed his father was born there too. This is 1910. We're moving to April here. Again, you want to keep track of the dates that these were filled out, because that can make a difference when you're looking at ages and births. We have one new state, Oklahoma. Not much changes geographically, not much changes anywhere actually. We still have our regular total population here of 92.2 million. Most populated state is still New York, least populated state is still Nevada. 1910 is fairly similar to previous layouts. Only a few clarification columns have been added here. As I said, we can note that this is condensed now down into married, single, divorced, or widowed. These teeny little numbers up here indicate not every person would have filled this out, but this particular census taker did, the number of marriage that they're on. So we have the age of their first marriage and what marriage they are on. So if you see here that we have somebody who's on a second marriage that you didn't realize should be on a second marriage, that can tell you a lot about what you need to research previously. Other information will include whether or not they were able to speak English, and if not, speak the language that was spoken. Occupation includes the general nature of industry, business, or establishment in which this person works. Whether or not they were out of work on April 15th of 1910. Number of weeks they were out of work for 1909. So again, when we're looking at this particular census in 1910, we're trying to get a feel for what they were looking for in this census. Employment seems to factor pretty heavily into here. The other arrow here is another indication of those random numbers that we were talking about a few censuses ago, the check marks that were in the box that didn't need to be in the box. This is probably for census taker use, tabulating something. We don't know what it is. It's a red herring. Whether they were a survivor of the Confederate Army or Union or Confederate Army or Navy. And here again, we're going to look at this same family. Again, his father is listed as being born in Vermont. All of Willis's half siblings and his father's first wife were all born in Vermont, so it's very likely that he believed his father had been born there too. From our new lines of information, we gather that he and Emma have been married for 28 years, that Willis owns his own store, and that he did not serve in the Civil War, which makes sense because he would have been like 4 years old at that time. Come on. There it goes. Okay, so our new states for 1920, we're moving right along. Arizona and New Mexico, still nobody wants to live in Nevada. Most populated state is still New York. This is the point where the threshold for the total population crosses 100 million. It's grown a lot in the last 100 years. Questions have been removed and amended. The how many children and how many living questions were dropped, probably for obvious reasons. So were questions pertaining to physical disabilities, the place of birth of father, and place of birth of mother now have supplementary questions asking about the mother tongue of each. You can see that here in this group, we have some German, some Swedish, some Irish, some French. The rest of the questions seem to be pretty identical to 1910. So we're going to skip over that one pretty quickly. Remember that supplementary materials when you're doing your census research can be just as important as the censuses themselves. Further research is always required to be sure that you have the correct person tied to the correct record. So here I was looking for my great grandmother, Maud, who was Willis's second daughter, and she wasn't with her family. I knew that she didn't get married until 1924, but I couldn't find her anywhere. So as I started doing my research, I ran across a newspaper article that mentioned that she was in town visiting her parents from the District of Columbia, which is where she was in 1920. She was actually a stenographer for the US Treasury at the time, so she had left to go to school, and that's why we couldn't find her where we thought she'd be. Again, you got to think outside that box sometimes. If people aren't where you think they should be, ask yourself why. I actually had never known that about my great-grandmother until I found that census record, and then I asked my grandfather about it. He was like, "Oh yeah, didn't I tell you that?" Obviously not. Okay, 1930. So here we are going straight. There are no boundary changes this year. No boundaries are really going to change until 1959 when I think that's Alaska or Hawaii. I can't remember which one came first, is added. Same most and least populated states. The country is in the full onslaught of the Great Depression at this point. The stock market crash happened in October of 1929, of course. So we're going to see a lot of information pertaining to that kind of thing. Mother tongue of each person has been removed and consolidated down to a column for language spoken in the home before coming to the US. The veteran census returns and the value of home section returns too. But most everything else is going to remain fairly similar. So here we have Maud. Like I said, she got married in 1924. We have her husband here and their children listed. You can see that Raymond and his family are renting at a cost of about $10 a month. Yeah, let's all just take a moment for that. They are all born citizens of the United States and so have nothing in the naturalization or language spoken before coming to the US columns here. Raymond is a veteran of the World War. It's just going to say World War because obviously we haven't had World War II yet. I think that's, yeah, I was going to say, I think that's all that's going to be covered here. Okay, this one changes quite a bit. So post Great Depression, there's a lot of information that they wanted to gather on the movements of the population and how much of an impact the Depression had had on the overall economy and daily lives of the US citizens. This is the last census that we have available to us. The 72-year rule that was put into place before it was released to the public. So that was the average lifespan of the United States citizen when that law was made. That's why it's 72 years. It's such a weird number. I had to figure that out. So the next one will be released April 15th of next year. April 1st. Okay, Mr. John thinks it's April 1st. April of next year, 2022. And it will be the 1950 census.
Sunday or something.
Yeah, depending on if it's a Sunday or something, he says. So like I said, quite a bit actually changes on this census. It's very fascinating to see what a snapshot of what the government was most interested in knowing throughout the years. We've covered citizenship, immigration, employment, home value, education, military information, so on and so forth. This census focuses pretty heavily on employment for obvious reasons. Again, we are just starting to kind of sort of climb out of the Great Depression. We won't really do that until after World War II. So they're trying to get information on how many people have moved, how many people have been unemployed, all that stuff. And looking again, not just at your target family, but at the greater community as a whole can paint a really good picture for you of what was going on in their lives at the time. There's a new section at the bottom, which is why I've chosen to include the entirety of the page on these two slides. This is the beginning of the long form questionnaire that we're all familiar with if we've participated in censuses in our lifetimes. So you know that when you get your census information, some of us get, well, not this last time because everybody took it online, but when you got your old census information, some of you would get like a real thick envelope and it had a lot more questions than the average short form had. This is the first time that we see something like that. People on lines 4 and 40 were chosen to answer these questions, no matter their age, sex, race, religion, whatever. So very quickly, from left to right, these people are tasked with answering the following questions. Uh-oh. Come here. There we go. Place of birth of father, mother, if foreign born, give the country. The birthplace was situated in January 1st of 1937. So it's specific to exactly when World War II started to kind of break out. Distinguished Canadian French from Canadian English, and Irish Free State from Northern Ireland. Language spoken in the home: is this person a veteran of the United States military forces or the wife, widow, or under 18 child of a veteran? If a child, is the father dead? War or military service they served in. For persons 14 years of age and older, do they have a social security number? Again, social security was just starting to be implemented at this time, so they're trying to track how many people are participating in the program. It's so weird for us today to think about people like not having a social security number. But at this point in time, it was, if you had one, it was rarely ever used. Usual occupation, usual industry, class of worker, and for women who have been married, have you been married more than once, age at your first marriage, and number of children ever born, not including stillbirths. So again, we're bringing those questions back. Just for certain people, only if you were chosen on those particular lines. This was just kind of a fun little thing I threw in here, but these marks let us know who answered the census questions. So you can actually like see who answered the door on that date. On this particular one, it was April 2nd or 3rd of 1940. Just kind of a fun little note. Just like today, elementary and middle school at this point went from 1st to 8th grade, high school 1 through high school 4, obviously, and C1 is college. I've seen this actually done, I needed to update these notes a little bit. I've seen this done a couple of ways. Some places this is degrees, not number of years. And in other places, the census taker would enumerate the number of years that person had attended college. So it might actually really not help you that much because it just depends on the way the census taker took that information. C2 would be a graduate degree and D for doctorate in this case. Again, like I said, that's subject to change depending on the census taker's decisions. This is the lines for the place of residence as of April 1st, 1935. So the city and town or village having more than 2,500 residents, enter rural for all other places. County, state, or territory, and whether or not it was on a farm. So again, 1935 was still the middle of the Great Depression. They're trying to see how many people had been moving around, where they had gone, how far they had traveled, trying to get an idea of the movements of people as a result of the fallout of the economic collapse. There are a lot of supplementary questions pertaining to employment on this census. As I said, these two questions are like ridiculously detailed, and I kind of had to Google to figure out exactly what it was they were asking. Was this person employed in non-emergency work as of this week or in emergency work as of this week? These two are basically, is this person actively seeking work? And if not, is it because they are already employed? And then indicate whether they were engaged in housework, school, unable to work, or other. So you can see here, as you're going through here, if you answer no to all of these questions and then you have an H in this box, that's probably why the person's not seeking employment. Her husband is bringing home enough money that she doesn't have to work outside the home, so she is a homemaker. School, whether or not they are unable to work. So a lot of times you'll see that for, really people who are really advanced in age or have some other form of physical disability. Number of weeks worked in 1939, how much they made, and whether or not they received income of $50 or more outside of those wages. So for the most part, you'll see no's in that column, couple of yeses from people who had second jobs of sorts. This is it. There are going to be a few things that we didn't cover, obviously, like I said, line by line, but this traces this whole family from 1850 to 1940 consecutively on censuses, filling in with things like newspaper articles, filling in with state censuses, other information, birth records, that kind of thing. So we have Raymond and his wife Maud, Ruth Ann, David, and Reed. Reed is my grandfather. So that traces from all the way down.
Is Maud 55?
Yes.
So she had Reed when she was 40?
She sure did. Those are not inaccurate. She was 11 years older than her husband. Yep. So there you go. That is what we have for this. That takes you through those censuses, 1850 to 1940, and it covers kind of what we were covering. I know it's a lot of information. It's a lot to throw at you. Now imagine what it was when it was the whole class covering from 1790 to 1940. Anybody have any questions? Did I not cover something that you thought you wanted to know? Yes, ma'am. Mhm. Yes. Yes. All of these. So she's asking whether or not my notes and everything that I had off to the side here and everything is going to be on there. And yes, when I condense it down to a PDF and put it up on the website, which I've not done yet, online people, sorry. All of my notes and everything, all this stuff down at the bottom will all be there as well. Anybody else? Oh, real quickly, before I let my online people go, I'm going to show you very quickly how to sign up for the next classes and then how to find those notes so that you can find them yourself. So hold on just 1 second. Stop it, computer. Okay, so you're going to come to ebrpl.com, which is our website. Right down here at the bottom, come here, is going to be our genealogy leaves. And this will take you to our genealogy info guide. This has links to all different kinds of things, key records. So this will tell you, here's a section on the censuses, specialty searches for adoptees and African-American research, Native American research, that kind of thing. Here is where our classes offered tab goes. And I update, well, Mr. John and I should say, Mr. John helps a lot. Update this as quickly as we can. Clearly, I did not do it very well this time because our class from October 6th is still up here. But you can see here what's upcoming. We have a great architectural speaker coming next week. We have David's new class, Tracing Your German Roots. I believe the in-person is full as of this morning. I think we put the last person on the list this morning. But I think there's still a couple slots in the virtual one. So if you want to sign up for that, make sure you do. These links will work for you there. Here is where our classes on demand and printable forms tab is. I don't know who updated that, but thank you. Because it used to just say classes on demand. Here's our class guides over here. So you can actually see, yes, here's our Understanding U.S. Census Records Part 2 coming soon. It will be up there, I promise, like ASAP. Here's where you can watch our old classes. Those need to be updated too. I haven't done it in a while. I apologize. And here's the forms and charts here. So this is the same stuff that we have sitting on the table over here for our in-person participants. You can download them yourself. Right here is the census comparison form. So it's going to tell you name of head of family only, which censuses that was included on, so on and so forth. So this is a really cool little piece. Go away. And then.
We added the cousins chart.
Yeah.
Oh, did we add the cousins chart? Where is it? Oh, the last one? Oh, cousinhood chart. Yes, yes. So if you've ever wanted to know how a second cousin twice removed works, you can find it on this chart. Second cousin twice removed, there it is. So that one is really helpful too. And then, is there anything? Oh, there is one other thing I wanted to share. Hold on 1 second. And this is how you can contact us. So if you have any questions that I did not go over today, or my online people who might need a little bit of help with that, the email that I emailed you for this class is my email. So if you got your Zoom link, you can contact that email if you have any questions. This is our location and our phone number. And these are our current hours. It's going to change, obviously, due to COVID. But for right now, this is when we're open. We are open as long as the library is open, with the exception of the last 15 minutes. We have to shut the archives down. So our department closes 15 minutes before the rest of the library. Yes, ma'am. PM. Oh, yeah. It does say, okay, I promise you Friday and Saturday, I'm not going to be here till 5:45 in the morning because I like my sleep. All right. Thank you, everybody, so much.